Welcome to the Past Precedent. It's the 29th century BCE and the flood murders everyone. What's the date specifically? Well, two of my sources pick dates between 28 and 2900, so the flood seemed to slide nicely into that 29th century BCE spot. But of course, it's complicated like everything else is in ancient history, so let's dive in. So did the Great Flood, like with Noah and the Ark, actually happen and wipe out everything I mentioned in my previous videos? Well, no. At least I don't think it did. And I realize I just split my audience in half with that declaration, but stick with me, hear me out until the end of the video, and you can argue your side in the comments. Simply, I hope. If you explore ancient history and myths around the world, you'll notice that the flood story pops up everywhere. As Professor Bauer put it, the historian cannot ignore the Great Flood. It is the closest thing to a universal story that the human race possesses. And most people in the Western world know the story of the Great Flood through Noah's Ark from the Bible. But ever since we deciphered the ancient languages of the Near East, like Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian, we've seen the flood story appear in various forms, before the Hebrews wrote it down in the Old Testament. The earliest flood stories were reintroduced to the world in 1872, when George Smith found a Babylonian version of the flood story written on a cuneiform tablet. Here, the Noah figure, who received the divine guidance to build an ark, was named Utnapishtim. After that, another version of the story was found. This time the Noah figure was named Atrahasis. And in the Sumerian version of the same story, the protagonist is Ziusudra. Then, if we zoom out from the Near East, we'll see similar flood stories show up all over the place. In Greek and Roman cultures, Indian, Chinese, Mayan, Incan, and dozens upon dozens of cultures around the world. Back in the ancient Near East, however, there is one interesting anomaly: Egypt. There isn't a similar flood story in Egypt, that I've found anyway. The closest thing I've found is the destruction of mankind, and it's a great story. The god Ra sensed a plot that mankind would revolt against him. So after a conversation with his council, he decides to destroy mankind, but not with a flood, rather with his daughter, Sekhmet, the lioness goddess. After a day of her massacring mankind, Ra is horrified by what's been done, and he wants his daughter to stop, but he realizes she's beyond control. He then has an idea. He turns beer red by mixing it with red ochre, and he floods the fields of Egypt with it. His daughter, thinking it's the flowing blood of mankind, drinks it, becomes intoxicated, and she abandons her mission. Mankind is saved. But this time, they were saved by a flood of beer. Saved again. If the Great Flood really happened, then it's odd that the flood story doesn't show up in Egypt, because it's all over the place in Mesopotamia. It's found as its own independent story. It's seen embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh and in the Sumerian Kings list. This list is an interesting artifact because one could try to estimate the date of the flood from it. On the list, there were 8 kings leading up to the flood, and just over 100 more kings ruled after it. The 22nd king after the flood, and I'll probably butcher his name, is Enmebaragesi. He is the first Mesopotamian king we can peg down in the historical record, believed to have ruled around 2700 BCE. And kings after him on the list can be grounded in history too. So by rooting the 22nd king in a date, we can begin to reasonably estimate when the flood might have happened. Sort of. Some of the reigns of these kings are absurdly long, like 20,000 years each. But a historian could look at the list and think, well, since some of the names are real, maybe the names of the older kings are real too, but their reigns were exaggerated for some reason. Then they could just reasonably estimate the reigns of these 22 kings back to the flood by using constraints available in the biological, historical, archaeological, and geological evidence. Come up with a range of when the flood happened, and maybe the date around 2900 BCE seems to fit best. This isn't, of course, precise history, but an estimation like this could give scholars something to look for, a placeholder, if you will, until more evidence is found. This exact same method has been used to calculate how old the Earth is according to another source, the Bible. The 17th century bishop James Ussher calculated that the Earth was created in exactly 4004 BC, and he estimated the Great Flood was around 2350 BC. So whenever you hear someone say the Earth is 6,000 years old, they're using a similar calculation. Then there's archaeologists like Leonard Woolley, who found evidence of floods in Mesopotamia, and he said, the total destruction of the human race is of course not involved, nor is even the total destruction of the inhabitants of the delta, but enough damage could be done to make a landmark in history, enough to define an epoch. And he dates a massive flood happening in Sumer around 2800 BCE. Next, if we take into account the work of geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, they suggest the flood stories were not a devastating Mesopotamian flood, but an inundation that permanently removed a people from their homes. When ice receded from the last ice age, the Bosphorus Strait was formed when the Black Sea burst into the Mediterranean, permanently flooding the area, and they date that flood story to around 7000 BCE. And finally, if we look at migration patterns and assume that the Great Flood happened once, with only one or a few survivors, then it must have happened before 10,000 BCE, before the hunter-gatherers migrated across the Bering Strait. That's a long ways away from 2900 BCE. So if we take all this evidence together, it doesn't really narrow down when the Great Flood actually happened, or if it happened at all. So why are we talking about it? Well, first is that the flood always seems to pop up in the ancient world in the form of religious or literary texts. So it's good to have some background on it and why it can be dated to around 2900 BCE or some other date. But a larger takeaway from the flood story, for the purposes of this project, is how different disciplines are trying to extract the veracity of the event. Or to use a term that historians love to use, historicity, which is the historical authenticity of an event. It's the foundation of every historical argument. What's the evidence and how authentic is it? In the case of the Great Flood, its strength is that cultures all over the world have a flood story. And to some, considering evidence in ancient history is limited, it's enough evidence to say that the story is true. However, once you start adding other evidence from geology, archaeology, linguistics, and genetics, it doesn't support the claim, let alone it happening sometime between 23 and 2900 BCE. It does support, however, that there were major localized floods and permanent inundations throughout the world, but not at the same time. So if we take all this together, a plausible explanation that allows all this to fit neatly is humans and animals need water to drink, to bathe, to farm, so they must live near ample water supplies. This proximity increases the probability that flash floods or tsunamis or hurricanes would take out whole communities from time to time. And to those ancient communities, that was their entire world. If we look specifically in Sumer, their mud brick homes are situated in between two rivers that are known for their violent flooding. So this region is primed to have a flood story that could wipe out everything. This could also explain why ancient Egyptians do not have a flood story. The Nile River is known for flooding predictably. So maybe the flood story is more about humankind's regional relationship with an aspect of their environment than anything else. Ancient people probably wondered, how could the substance of our world, water, give life to our crops, and it sustains our own lives, and we bathe in it, but it can also wipe us out? Clearly there must be a reason for it, and these stories are an attempt to answer that question. Of course, I don't know the answer for certain, but I'm just taking the evidence that's presented to me, filtering it through my biases, and landing on a plausible explanation. And people who believe the flood was real are doing the same thing, looking at the evidence, filtering it through their biases, and providing their own explanation. Okay, so before everyone goes out into the world and argues that their assessment of the evidence is correct, do me a favor. Listen to the other argument first, fully and respectfully, especially if you're truly trying to discuss history properly to hone the historicity of an event. Try to really understand it. Ask questions as many times as needed until you understand it. Not agree with it, just understand it. Restate the argument in the strongest way possible so that they agree with how you frame it. Then respond. And when you do, respond to the argument only in a well-reasoned, neutral tone. Don't attack the person. Don't assume anything or misrepresent the other person's argument. Just scrutinize the argument in hand and do more research if needed. Continue this back and forth until the evidence of both sides is clearly defined. Then you can discuss in the same respectful way the veracity and interpretation of each piece of evidence supporting the claims. If one claim cannot dismiss the other, then at least you can firmly establish the breadth of the argument. This process of clearly weighing each piece of evidence is more important than the beliefs that fill in the gaps. And also, it's okay to say I don't know. This process does more justice to illuminate the historicity of an event than anything else. For some generations of historians, due to limited technology and evidence, clearly organizing and outlining an argument is the best they can do. Their work can lead the next generation to discover something new, add it to the conversation, and possibly resolve it. Now go discuss history properly. So that's it, our fourth date, 29th century BCE, the flood murders everyone. Only 49 dates to go. If you have any questions or know a lot already, in the comment section, please post anything you think is essential to understanding this century or this topic. If you're adding new information, please cite your sources. I'll be monitoring what's going on, and in my conclusion videos for this project, I'll highlight how we've expanded its historiography and list any questions that seem to be left unanswered. At that point, we'll have a stronger foundation for my next project and all future projects. And of course, if you're an expert and you want to share your knowledge to help guide us, please feel free to join the conversation Or if you're interested, I'd love to interview you and post it right here. So contact me. If you just found me for the first time and are curious what this is all about, go check out my intro videos to both this project and this channel. And as always, subscribe, like, donate some money to keep this show going, click the notification so you know when the next video is up, and I'll see you then.